Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our Missouri Trailblazers program on Henrietta Bruns, brought to you today by the Missouri State Museum. My name is Pam, and I'm the branch lead here at the Holt Summit Public Library, which is a branch of the Daniel Boone Regional Library. Joining me today is Lauren, who is the Adult and Community Services Manager for Daniel Boone. Hi, Lauren.
Hi, Pam.
Okay, before I introduce today's presenter, I would like to go over a few Zoom housekeeping items. On your Zoom screen, if you hover or tap, you should see a raise hand icon and a chat bubble icon. Everyone's microphones are currently muted. If you'd like to ask a question at the end of the presentation, select the hand icon and Lauren will unmute you. You can also enter your questions or comments into the chat, which I will be keeping an eye on throughout the program. We want to let you know that today's program is being recorded and will be made available on the museum's Facebook page and the library's YouTube channel after it has been edited. If you're watching with a group, please let us know how many are watching at your location by putting it into the chat. Today's program is a continuation of the Missouri Trailblazers series featuring trailblazers who have impacted Missouri. I would like to say a special thank you to the Missouri State Museum for their partnership in organizing these fabulous presentations. I will now turn things over to Tiffany Patterson, who is the director for the Missouri State Museum and their Jefferson Landing State Historic Site, located in Jefferson City, Missouri. Tiffany, would you like to say a few words about what's going on in the museum?
Sure. Thank you, Pam and Lauren. We are very excited to continue this partnership, and I know you will be promoting next year's events. We're continuing this on into the rest of this year and into next year, so we're very excited about the opportunity to share and partner. I'm not going to go into the long list of events, just a couple that are coming up between now and your next Daniel Boone Regional Library program with us, and that includes our next landing after hours on this is October. Welcome to fall. It feels like July outside, but our next program is October 5th, and it will be on the Capitol Lunettes, Oscar E. Baringhouse, and the Tau Society Artist. And Sarah Jones, who is a museum educator and art historian with Missouri State Museum, will be giving that presentation. That will be a hybrid presentation, so we will have opportunity to see it live. It will be here at Jefferson Landing State Historic Site at 100 Jefferson Street at 7 p.m. on October 5th. Or if you want to watch us from home, it will be on Facebook Live on the Missouri State Museum's Facebook page. So you can get on Facebook, look for the Missouri State Museum, and watch it there. That same week, on October 7th, we will be hosting Teaching American History Workshop, African American Literature. And that is a partnership with Teaching American History, which is a national organization that helps bring free teaching resources to educators across the United States. And that workshop will be from 8:30 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. on October 7th, also here at Jefferson Landing State Historic Site. It is free, but registration is required. So if you go to teachingamericanhistory.org, you can search for that seminar and sign up for it. We are looking to add a few more people to the registration, so we'd love to see you. And that is, again, I said it was free, but we will serve you lunch. So that's an added bonus. Not only is it a free seminar where you can get continuing education credits if you are a teacher, but we will feed you. So that's always nice. We also have a couple of new things in the museum. If you haven't visited us lately, we have 3 new temporary exhibits. One is Missouri Made, which features Missouri Made art items from the Missouri State Museum collection, and it's kind of fun and eclectic. Kind of a peek behind the scenes of what we have in our collection. We also have a temporary exhibit that we're calling Trouble and Triumph. It's part of a program a class project that we did in partnership with students from Lincoln University last fall. And so it highlights their work and the work of that class. And we also have Earth Day Art in Missouri State Parks, which highlights the winners of the Missouri State Parks Earth Day Art Contest this year. And if you visit us in the next month or so, we will be doing some new rotations in our Trailblazer exhibit. So right now we just put in Lee Mace from the Ozark Opry, his upright bass. And then on October 13th, we're going to be doing a rotation that includes information on the Fulton State Hospital, Stark Brothers Nursery, and Jerry Linton, who was a state representative, but also very influential in Missouri agriculture. So we will be installing those in October, and they will be ready to see on the 14th. So that's kind of a highlight of what's coming down at the Missouri State Museum.
Okay, thank you, Tiffany. That sounds like a lot of fun. Well, today, as I stated earlier, today's program is about Henrietta Bruns. Today, we want to welcome back Steve Anna Landwehr. Steve Anna is from Jefferson City, and she's an interpreter with the Missouri State Museum. She has taught at both grade school and college levels. She majored in history and political science, which is why she enjoys working at the museum. In her free time, she likes to train and care for horses. She has worked at the Reality House in Columbia as a substance abuse counselor and for the Diocese of Jefferson City. Welcome, Steve Anna, and I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you very much for the intro, and it's really good to be here. I have been interested in Henrietta Bruns for quite a while, and I've only now done considerable research about her and the things that she did. And in the process, I discovered, of course, that she was a trailblazer. And you kind of wonder, well, what areas was she trailblazing in? And I looked around a little bit. And by the way, I don't consider myself to be an expert in any way, shape, or form in this, but I have done quite a bit of looking around. And so I'm here to present what I found. So if you have questions or comments, I really appreciate anything you'd like to add or any questions that you have. So go for it when we have the time at the end of the program. I titled this with a quotation of her own words. She said, "I'm a pioneer by nature." And she described herself in that way. So I kind of wondered, where were the trailblazing aspects of her life? And so I discovered, just over briefly, that she was one of the founders of Westphalia, Missouri community in 1838. Then another aspect was the fact that she was a businesswoman in Jefferson City during the Civil War. So I looked at those two aspects and I said, okay, trailblazer, yes, but what were the characteristics of that trailblazing or those trailblazing experiences, which would provide a way in which she was enabled to do these extraordinary things, which was helping to open up a very, very wilderness area in the very early days of Westphalia, Missouri. And then also during the Civil War, she was a businesswoman because she really needed to provide for her family. And so that resulted in her activity as a businesswoman in Jefferson City. But the question then becomes one of what challenges did she meet as she moved into these trailblazing areas? And so I discovered that there were several things that occurred in those trailblazing experiences that were extreme challenges. The challenges were probably challenges that other trailblazers have met as well. However, I would have to say that she did an extraordinary job of responding to those trailblazing experiences. And so that's what we're going to be really looking at today. The challenges that she faced were such things as, number one, raising and caring for her family as she went around the business of being a founder of Westphalia and a businesswoman. So it was her family. She experienced frequent moves. She experienced traveling a lot. She experienced community engagement arranging for her children's education throughout this process. And she had 11 children. Some of them died through disease. None of them died during childbirth, but a lot of them died during diseases that were rampant in many of the areas where they lived. And the sicknesses that they experienced were extraordinary. So that's kind of like a little intro and an observation that provides indication of how we're going to go with this presentation today. She also lived according to some values, faith, freedom, and family, that she lived to according to herself throughout her whole life. By the way, I would want to add one more thing in this little intro. She wrote a book. Actually, it was a published book that I have here, and it's called My Life Story. Now, she didn't actually publish this, but these were the letters that some other people gathered together after she died, and they tell quite a bit of the story of her life. And so what I did in preparing this presentation was to simply go through the book and record the numbers of times she talked about taking care of her family, the numbers of times she talked about traveling, the numbers of times she talked about community involvement with the other people in the community there. I looked to see how many times she described her activity with sicknesses and also the experiences that they had with death, which was very much a part of life in those days. And so this is the way I prepared this. So I'm gathering together documented times when she described herself as involved in these situations, so that you could actually take some of those things and apply them to trailblazers everywhere, trailblazers today that are living in the lives that we have today, and also trailblazers then. She also described what she did as an inclination versus duty. I'll repeat that, an inclination versus duty. She was oftentimes torn by what maybe she'd like to do with a duty that she felt. And so these were the things that really inspired her life. So with this kind of brief explanation, we're going to press forward and see where she came from. Very interesting, because this is a picture of her house where she was raised in Stromberg, Germany. Actually, it was described as oldie, but it was also Stromberg. She described her log cabin in Westphalia as smaller than the living room of their house at home. They were a very well-to-do family. She was born in 1813. Her father was a tax collector, and he was also a mayor of the town. Her mother's parents were linen merchants, and she probably never really experienced the life of a farmer, although she was plunged into that in Missouri. But in Germany, the closest thing she came to farming was working in her mother's garden, which was pretty typical. She described the earliest memories of the Christmas tree at her grandmother's house when she saw lighted candles. She was very well raised and educated. She learned how to cook and sew. She took lessons reading, writing, and arithmetic. She took language lessons, describing to be able to speak in other languages. Most of her social life, however, was spent with family and neighborhoods, and they had dances and balls and music recitals because she played and sang various musical instruments. At some points, she went to live with other families throughout Germany because they would help her to learn certain housekeeping skills. She had many, many, many happy hours, and she traveled with her family, particularly her father, to political occasions like Munich and Munster and Lilburn. Some of these were vacations, but it was pretty strenuous because they had to travel with horses and buggies and wagons and things like that. Henrietta, first, there is the quotation that she uses to describe herself is oftentimes torn between inclination and duty. And the first time that quotation appeared in the writing was when she was involved with her husband to be, Dr. Bruns. Here she is as a young woman. She took that picture, however, when she was a young woman in Missouri. She was, I guess, about 19 when she married. Well, she was 16 when she first met Dr. Bruns, but she was 19 when she went with him to Missouri. And prior to the time of her wedding, her mother died, and she continued. She had 4 brothers and a sister, I think, if I remember correctly. And she was taking care of them, not only taking care of them when her mother died, but also taking care of the family when she was beginning to be engaged with Dr. Bruns. And so that there really was no big transition between herself and her young children, her family's young children and Dr. Bruns. When she met Dr. Bruns, and here he is, she was, like I said, 16, and they were married when she was 19. At that time, he was a student in medical school, studying to be a doctor. And they continued to live after they were married in the house where she grew up. And she oftentimes described the way she met him. And that was that he asked if he could take her home and walk her home after some of the balls and social events that they had around in the area for the family. So it was pretty much of a natural thing. And people objected when she and he decided to marry because they said she was too young, but they overcame that. At that point in time, she even had a guardian. Her father had died as well. And so they had to overcome sentiments of opposition to him because he was a little bit older than she. And she struck out and said, no, I love him. And regardless, I'm going to marry him. And they went about the business of arranging that thing, their marriage. She kept house for him and for her brothers and sisters for a while. And then Dr. Bruns decided that he wanted to go to Missouri. And that was about the time that the Duden research and articles and letters had been written from Missouri to the people in Germany, and he was attracted to that. There really isn't a good description as to why they came, except that he oftentimes wanted to serve people who were poor, and certainly he was getting himself into that spot when he went to Missouri. So he spent a year in Missouri looking around, seeing what he had to do. He even had built a little cabin for them so that it would be ready when they came. And so they left for Missouri in July of 1836, and they arrived in Missouri in November. Not a very good time because it would be cold, but that was where they were. She often describes that trip as being what would be very, very hard in terms of today, because they had to go through from Bremen to Bremerhaven to get to the boat. They transferred to 2 or 3 boats across the channel, and then they were finally on the ocean. And then they spent 66 days on the ocean and arrived in Baltimore. But then the trouble was not over, because they had to go to New York to connect with some family members, and they did that. And then they went over the Alleghenies in a wagon, and sometimes they even used canals to go from certain parts of the country, because there was a lot of use of canals. So they actually went to Cincinnati by boat on a steamer, and During some of that time, Dr. Bruns himself became ill because it looked like the problem was that the food was not good on the boats. And so until she could get a grip on the cooking and began to do cooking herself on the boats, they were oftentimes not very well. And she also, I forgot to mention, she also brought along with them her two older brothers. And they wanted to go to Missouri and to be there. They didn't want to stay in Germany. So they had quite an entourage of people who were traveling with them. Eventually, they went down the Ohio, and they then traveled up the Missouri to the Osage. And then from the Osage, they got to the mouth of the Mary's River, which is not very far from here. And they went to a little town called Lyletown, which is still marked on the road going to St. Louis Highway 50, I guess, and it's marked there as Lyletown. And I recorded, kept track of the times that she mentioned traveling. And there were 25 times. 10 times she traveled around before she went to Missouri. And then after that, there were 25 times that she traveled around in Missouri. But when she finally reached Missouri, she described something really wonderful. She said, "We were traveling through a beautiful country in a free nation." And there you have the quotation that she actually used to describe their experience. And it was a free nation. This is a sketch of the house that they built in Westphalia. Pretty realistic. The little cabin was one of the little outbuildings there that you see, and they eventually built that larger house. Now that larger house is still standing, and we have some older pictures of that, which we will look at, but that was the house that they built and they lived in. At one point in time when they had trouble building it, she said, "I wish we hadn't planned to build such a big house, because we would have been just as comfortable in a small cabin, because it was cold and they didn't have good heating." And she also talked about how when they came first, they didn't have any food, but they had arranged for a hog that they would butcher when they got here, which they did, and so that they had fresh pork. They had to borrow bread and milk from some neighbors, which would have lived about a mile away. And so that was the beginning of their life there. That was the challenge that I would call traveling. She did a lot of traveling. The house that is described in the sketch is this house, realistically drawn, pictured in a photo from about 1911. It still stands, and must have been very strong and very sturdy. And there are some people that you can see. One is on the hearth, and then there's some people around the front porch. So it still stands there as a tribute, and as people keep track and keep it up. And it's a very historic place. Another of her challenging experiences had to do with community engagement. Westphalia, as a town then, was very, very small, but they had a lot of people who were living in the surrounding areas. And as time went on, as a community leader, she engaged with, exchanged food, flowers, produce, and services with all of her neighbors. She maintained contact with individuals who supplied food for them, and then she and Dr. Bruns involved themselves with providing medicine and education. But she also utilized some of the people in the communities for educational opportunities. Some of the families who had been there before had educational experiences, and they would exchange goods and services to provide education for each other's children, and they did a little bit of that. Eventually, they moved to a place called Shipley Ferry, which Dr. Bruns wanted to move to because he wanted to do a little more farming, and was kind of like worn out from all of the contacts he had made with the sick people in the community. And so he moved to Shipley Ferry, and she stayed in their house here. During that time, she began to be what you'd call a businesswoman, because they rented out certain parts of the house as a room for people to store things or as people to live there on their way further west. So she had to keep track of their money. She had to keep track of the days that they spent time there. They built a horse mill and a flower garden, and she exchanged a lot of flowers with friends across the Osage River. And they had made acquaintance with Senator Thomas Hart Benton in the very early days, and he sent them a lot of seeds, particularly asparagus seeds, and they harvested those and gave away some of those, including they raised fruit, peaches particularly. So at least 10 times she describes engagement with the community involving even beginning businesses. I think probably the worst, most horrendous challenges which she faced, however, were sicknesses. And I recorded 69 times when she, in this little book, described the sicknesses that they felt. And sometimes the whole communities were decimated with dysentery and a thing that they called summer fever. And I could never understand exactly what that was, and she didn't describe it, but it was some sort of a fever that would debilitate people, and particularly movement in their gait, but it was a fever. And the only way that they could really for surely get over it was by enduring it and resting. Dr. Bruns, however, had some things that he used as medicines, and whenever something like that appeared in their own family, he immediately began to give it to them. But the flu was something that really decimated them and took one of her children's life as a very young child. One time she said that 2/3 of Westphalia community died because of this dysentery. She was oftentimes sick herself. She was not immune to the sicknesses, and neither was Dr. Bruns. And so sickness was something that they always felt, and people would always come to experience them with their experiences with the fevers and the sicknesses to them, because they knew that they had a source of helping them out. So they did. There were several significant moves that took place in their lives. The moves I totaled to be about 9 times. They moved from her family in Germany to Missouri to live. They stayed in Westphalia for 15 years. They built a house there, barns and gardens. And in 1851, they moved to this place that I called Shipley Ferry. And there was a farm there, but they also managed a ferry going across the Osage, which was a big deal. And so they would help people going across. They managed the ferry. And she was a very strong, active participant in keeping track of the times that they were engaged at the ferry and ways that they helped other people get to where they were wanting to go across the river. The house there had a large room, and it became not only a house or a store. The house there where they lived at Shipley Ferry is not available, is not there anymore, but it is recorded as a place. When she was a businesswoman, this was an area where she was a trailblazer, and I'm describing a little bit of that. And I found about 8 times where she described herself as taking care of business. She managed stores, farms, ferries, and none of these ventures failed, except maybe remotely one that they established in St. Louis where she had a boarding house. She mentioned the only experience that she really had that would have provided an insight into how to manage a business was going with her father on tax collecting trips. She didn't talk about learning too much, but she obviously must have, because she was able to keep books and able to record things that were important to keeping the business together. During the Civil War, things changed quite a bit because Dr. Bruns was a surgeon in the Army, the Union Army, but he died in April of 1864. And this left her with the house that they built, which you see in this building right here, the Bruns house on Washington and High Street in Jefferson City. This picture was taken in 1920. It is not there anymore as a house, But there is another building, which we'll see in a few minutes, that shows the place where they worked. But she opened this after he died. She had 5 children, if I remember correctly, that she had to raise. And they still owed some money on that house because they hadn't completed the building of it before he died. And so she had to raise the money to finish the expenses on the house and then continue to raise her family. And she did a good job with that. She was quite an entrepreneur, I guess you would say, because she had a lot of contacts with legislators. And during the years of the Civil War, the legislators would come to Jefferson City to live during the time that they were engaged in lawmaking in the Capitol, and they would stay at her house. And she had a very large area where it was kind of like a lounge where they could sit and relax and talk. And that was a very favorite place for everybody in the city to come and enjoy company and relaxation. She was also a good cook, and so she would provide food for those people who lived in the boarding house. So it was quite a success. She, and I recorded 30 times that this kind of activity was mentioned, and she described herself and the kinds of things that she had to do. Another area in which she excelled was the care that she gave her family. There were 79 examples of the care she gave to her extended family, including her own brothers and sisters in Germany and her aunts and uncles. The first example she relates is spending time with her grandmother, and she had many happy days with her and grieved terribly when she died. When her own father died, she was preparing for a marriage, but she continued to keep house, as I said, for everybody. After one of her brothers, Franz, who came to Missouri, died shortly before the Civil War, she took care of his 3 children into her own house, and she raised them. And she cared for his son Casper when he was wounded as a soldier in the Civil War. Although her care for family was evidenced at an early age, and was directed toward her extended family, she was even more dedicated to her husband and children. Several of the children died from diseases of various kinds. Like I said, the fever and dysentery. She took care of them all when they were sick. And she didn't really have any experience as a medical personnel, but she had learned a lot from her husband and followed his directions. And so she would oftentimes be the nurse. But she was very careful of her children and their education. All of the children went to school. And if they didn't go to school, they were homeschooled. Those who lived past the age of 5 were given extensive education. They went to school beyond what had been expected in the 8th grade. One went to school in Columbia, Missouri. Another attended school in St. Louis at the St. Louis University with the Jesuits. Girls as well as boys were educated, and she said that they oftentimes were students at the parish school in Westphalia in 1856. But shortly after that, Dr. Bruns hired a teacher to work with them at home. During the Civil War, her attention to her own children became even more intense. And her son Heinrich enlisted in the Union Army, and he served under the German General Franz Sigel. Heinrich was killed, however, in the Battle of Utica in Mississippi in 1863, but he was brought home for a burial. And because of the problems of transportation and preparing his coffin and all that kind of stuff, his body was pretty well deteriorated by the time it was buried, and that grieved her terribly. She continued to be concerned for her children. After that, she traveled to St. Louis when she had lived in Jefferson City to visit her family. She oftentimes went to Toledo when one of them moved there. And she even purchased a small farm outside of Jefferson City where she and her son Wilhelm could grow produce for sale. Thank you. Yeah, I need to take a little break here and wet my whistle here. This is an example. This is a house. This is not a house. This is a storefront. that they built and used during the Civil War. And it exists on the corner of High Street and Jefferson. Still exists today, looks pretty much like that. Picture was taken a couple of years ago, and it houses a law firm now, Cook, Vander, Deerhoff, and Landwehr law offices. So it exists today, but that was originally one of the Bruns stores. Very, very lovely building and very much in good repair. If you look, one of the pictures, the larger one, is kind of dark and maybe a little bit older, but the other side has a lighter picture and it shows kind of like the sun shining on it. So it's a very lovely building. Eventually, two sons, Wilhelm and Louis, moved to Seattle. And she mentions 21 times concerning simply helping her own children, not only other extended family, but also her own children. But I would say, checking time here, pretty good. She confronted death oftentimes. This was a big deal because it seems like death was considered to be a matter of course in a way. It wasn't a trauma type of thing. It was kind of like a thing that happened. It just happened. But she mentions 25 times the experiences that she had with death. And this included death not only of her own children, but also of her own family, her extended family. And then also family and friends. So death was a challenge. And she describes the care that she gave, for instance, to her husband when he was dying. And she describes how she sat with him and she went outside to look at some children who were chopping wood outside in the back of the house. And when she came back, he had died. And so she was very regretful of that. And one time I noticed she said that at the death of Adolf, one of her children, she said, "We lost him." And that was the way they described death. It was not a traumatic thing. It was more of a matter of course, but it was no less traumatic for the emotions that it called front for her. So 25 times she mentioned death. One time she was very sick and she had been caring for people her own family who were sick and dying. And she said she just couldn't hardly go on. And she was in despairing. And she said that she remembered what her husband said one time, and that was that she had duties to do. She couldn't just stop because she felt bad. She had to keep on going because she had duties to do. And she always remembered that and cited that several different times when she was caring for people who were very, very sick and very ill. So, she was quite an inspiration. Eventually, when the war was over, she continued to live in Jefferson City for the most part, in various places. Sometimes for a little while, she lived in St. Louis, but that didn't last very long. And so she moved back to Jefferson City. Her family dispersed quite a bit. They married and they went to live in other cities. St. Louis was one, Toledo, Seattle, other places. And she traveled extensively to visit with them and to keep in touch with them. So I guess got a few more slides here we need to see. This is Casper. Casper was her nephew, her brother Francis' son, and he too was wounded in the Civil War in 1862, and then he died from his wounds in Jefferson City. He came back from the war because he was so totally disabled, but then he eventually died. Quite a handsome fellow, and looks like them as they got older. So here they are, Dr. Bruns and Henrietta. Her name oftentimes has been known to be Etta, and she describes some of the ways that she was called differently by different people. But the letters that she wrote to her family are contained in this book, this story, which was edited by the GEISBERGs and also by Walter Schroeder in Jefferson City. And you can buy a copy of that book whenever you get a chance, if you'd like to. And it tells some of the story in her own words. And these are words that she wrote. This is not something that somebody else added to or subtracted from or gathered from, but she actually wrote these words that are words that I have described. Looking here through some of my notes to see if I've missed anything. I guess you could say she was very unique in that she settled in a land that was very different from her own. It was relatively uninhabited. They had to go for miles before they found their neighbors. She oftentimes said that it was a big deal if they had visits from people who were their neighbors in their area. She probably, however, in all of this challenge that she experienced, probably was not any different than other people who were trailblazers for the area. So, I oftentimes see her to be typical of some of the people that were living in Westphalia and in Jefferson City at the time. She does describe some kind of sad experiences. She said there was a woman who came to visit with her sometimes, and one time she came and wanted some coffee grounds, and she said that she was very insistent that she pay her for the coffee. The woman who wanted the coffee wanted to pay her, and she didn't want to accept anything, but eventually she did because the woman was so insistent. And then she describes that eventually that woman was so distraught with living in that kind of an environment that she left and went back to Germany. She also describes a man named Helms, I think it was, who was one of the original people who settled in Westphalia. And eventually his wife persuaded him to return, at least if that didn't happen exactly from the pressure of his wife, at least he felt pressure to return to Germany. And so sometimes people did not stay. They did not survive this kind of trailblazing experience. So oftentimes they did not have the kind of like the successful conclusion that was hers. And so I attribute that to some of her quotations, like, I put duty before inclination. I was a trailblazer by nature. Her values were faith, freedom, and family, and she stuck with those. And it's not to say that those people who live there in those communities did not live that way, but sometimes they just were overburdened with the pressures of living in an environment like that. Because in that kind of situation, you had to provide all of your food, your clothing, your shelter, everything had to be provided by you in your community. And at the same time that you were trying to struggle to make, like, say, blankets or make a coat, you were struggling to stay alive that day and maybe to put food on the table for that day. And they didn't have the conveniences that we have to preserve food. So living conditions were very extraordinary in those days. So a life like this gives us courage to say, well, things might be sort of tough, but just think of how tough they were for those people, and they survived. So that kind of brings a little bit of a conclusion to my presentation on Henrietta. I hope that everything has come across in a clearer fashion, because it's kind of hard sometimes to entangle all of the things that were operative in the communities there. I was looking forward to some conclusion here in a way, because there's going to be a program on work, I think, or entrepreneurs in September. In September, I guess, of next year. And I'm going to do two women, Annie Fisher and Annie Malone, who were two, I hate to say trailblazers, but they were entrepreneurs actually describing in this program. And they came from different times. Well, actually not exactly different times. They were both either children of slaves or they were actually slaves themselves, either the two of them. But they became millionaires, one in St. Louis and one in Columbia, actually. Annie Fisher was an entrepreneur, a person who had to survive and became a very, very, very well-known cook and made a good living for herself. Annie Malone made her living by making and selling, distributing cosmetics. So they had very interesting stories, but they are similar in terms of their dedication to Henrietta. So I encourage you to kind of be looking out for that when next year kind of rolls around, because I'll have some more interesting things to say about them. So I guess, let me see what time it is. It is about 10 till 2.
Did you want to show them your bibliography slide?
Yes, please.
Yeah, why don't you, advance to that one so they know.
There, forgot. Okay, these were several of the books that I used. Gary Kramer's We Are Living in Very Stirring Times, and that's the story of the Civil War, and he highlights some of the things that she experienced. Then my life story is the document that I quoted from. And then Hold Dear, Always, as Always, was another series of her letters published by the University of Missouri Press. So that gives you an idea of where you can find some more information. There was an article in the Jeff City newspaper about a year ago that described some of her experiences as well in Jefferson City. So there's a lot more that can be described by digging up some things about her life that I would encourage anyone who's interested to go for it. And if I have time, I'll keep on looking around. So I'll kind of like draw myself to a conclusion here and be interested in any questions or anything anybody would like to talk about.
Lauren, would you like to ask your question?
Oh, sure. So I was just curious about, I mean, she lived a great many years after her husband died. And do you have any information or maybe just ideas or, assumptions about why she did not remarry, especially if I understand it, she was left with some debt after he died and had to run the boarding house and things like that. Was remarrying at the age of, late 40s, was that something that was done or would have been common?
Yes, it would have been common, but she did not choose to do that. And there's never any discussion of that as even a possibility in her letters. Now, maybe something came about that I'm not aware of, but nothing in the letters indicate that she ever entertained that. I would suggest that she was so preoccupied with the well-being of her children at the time that she could not disengage herself from them to make another beginning of life herself. I guess that's the way I put it. But she lived a long time. I think she died, what is it? What was it? 1990, 18. She died in 1899. So she lived a long time after he died. Yeah, good point. Yeah. More questions?
I have a question for you.
Sure.
In all your research, did anyone find anything, whether they had a connection to the Lohman building itself? They're the Bruns family?
No, there's no mention in anything that I have seen, either from the standpoint of Lohman or from her standpoint, where they made any contacts there. I would say probably inevitably they had some connections because they had goods and services that moved through their store that had to probably come from Lohman's Landing and the river, but they don't mention that. She does not really describe the way they got the things in their storehouse. That's an interesting question too. Now, that's not to say that you couldn't find that out, because eventually you would be able to, but I did not. That's a good question.
I am struck by how different her life in Missouri is from the kind of wealth that you describe of her upbringing, that big house, and then coming to Missouri, living in a house that was the size of the living room, you said, of where she used to live. And does she, in the letters home, at least initially, does she talk about that discrepancy or highlight that discrepancy? I just cannot imagine going from one life to another like that, to suddenly, you're having to do everything for yourself on the land, from building where you're living to growing your own food. And it sounds like with her family upbringing, she was very well off.
Yes, and that was a point that I made initially when we started. And that was the contrast between what she experienced as a young person and then where she ended up. And she describes her life here in Missouri and in very graphic terms, in terms of how hard it was, but she never provides a contrast. The only contrast that she made was the one I mentioned, where she said that the living room of their house, the cabin was as, how do you say this? The cabin that they lived in Missouri was the size of their living room. That's the only contrast that she ever made. She never decried, she never contrasted, she never complained, she never provided a contrast in any way, shape, or form with the differences between Germany and here. And she never indicated any longing to go back there. That was kind of an interesting thing, because the people that I mentioned as being unsuccessfully living there eventually, they were longing to go back to where things were and where things were easy and good. But she never in any of the things that I read about her decried or made a contrast between how terrible things were with what she was when she grew up. Now, she was very clear about what her childhood was and all of the good things that she had, but she never made any remarks that said, well, and then I lost all of that, or never anything like that. Good point. Good points. Good points, guys.
Is there anything you would like to tell us that maybe we missed there in the few minutes that we have left?
I'm curious about, I know that a lot of Germans immigrated. What inspired them to do so? I mean, obviously this was the will of her husband, like you said, but do you know what, because obviously life here was a lot harder than I think they probably had been led to believe.
I kind of said that, and it might have not been cast in exactly a nice or outstanding way, but she did not describe very clearly why he wanted to go, except to say that his desire was to serve people who were poor. Mm. And she kind of implied that there would be more people there that he could serve in Missouri than the people in Germany. He was not concerned about making money there or here, but he wanted to go. And whether there were some other things going on that were a wanderlust maybe, or maybe a better life or something like that, that never is mentioned, although it might have been there. But her play into that was, her inclination was not to go, because she was oftentimes bound with a contrast between inclination and duty, and she chose duty all the time. And that was the way that she got there. And it's remarkable in that she never complained or disparaged that or blamed him or things would have been better or anything. None of that. Just plunging right on into whatever it took to keep them alive was the goal. And to provide a good life for them, because one thing that always impressed me was that they all those children got good educations. Good educations. One of them went to the University of Missouri in Columbia, and one of them went to St. Louis University, some of the older ones. And all of them, including the girls, were educated. And there was no discrimination between the boys and the girls in the family.
I just find that amazing that in all those letters home that she never complained. And it seems like she was so resourceful and like you said, probably learned at her father's side the bookkeeping and the tax collecting and that. So she had a business head from that, and then she picked up some things from her husband in terms of caring for people. And so it just seems like I'm just super impressed. I guess that's a comment. It's not a question. I'm just really impressed, and I'm glad that someone was thoughtful enough to save all these letters.
Yeah. Well, her family in Germany saved some of them. And then there were some people that deposited them in one of the historic societies here in Missouri. And I don't know where you'd go to find more information about her, but I'm going to keep that in mind. And if I can, I'm going to kind of struggle around, might talk to some people. They might have some insight into where you can get some more information about her, because it's really true what you say. It's really true.
That was fantastic. I wanted to let you know that someone typed in the chat, Steve Anna, that they enjoyed this presentation. Thank you for sharing information about this trailblazer in Missouri. She lived an amazing life. So
Yeah, it's good to know. Thanks for all the comments.
we thank you again for sharing your time and
My
expertise
pleasure.
with us.
My pleasure. My
Yeah,
pleasure.
we want to encourage everyone to join us again in October. This time we're going to be highlighting Red Fox. You can check out Missouri State Museum's website as well as Daniel Boone's. If you're interested in any past events, you can go on to our website and you can link up there. Lauren is putting it in the chat there. Also wanted to let you know that the Missouri State Museum is actually going to be coming to this location in October as well, towards the end. We have our wizard, Lucas Schwartz, coming from the Missouri State Museum for some Halloween fun to share with family and kiddos some stories, and then Ozark-based tales. That will be happening Tuesday, October 25th from 4:30 to 5:30. We want to thank everyone for joining us today, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of your day. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.